Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
It's day one of the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, or at least it is in theory. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz, coming to you live after the U.S. and Iran agreed to stop fighting for 2 weeks. And yet today, strikes continue sporadically across the Middle East and in Lebanon, where Israel is still conducting operations against Hezbollah. And for that reason, the Strait of Hormuz is not yet fully reopened. We have a lot to dig into this hour. We'll get the latest from the White House with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall and analysis from our political panel. Plus, as the administration and President Trump are claiming that this has been an outright military victory for the United States, we'll get a sense of the extent to which that is true as the former commander of CENTCOM, General Fink McKenzie, will join us shortly. We'll also speak with Democratic Congresswoman, that is Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for her reaction later this hour. But we begin with the market's reaction to all of this, because it has been fast and it has been furious. And that's where we start with Amy Morris here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Kailey. You know, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is now telling reporters that the Senate's expected to vote next week on a war powers resolution, and Iran's semi-official news agency says Tehran is now preparing a heavy response to Israel's attack on Lebanon. So we're going to watch all of that, and so are the markets. Right now we're seeing S&P 500 up 2.5%. That's 168 points. NASDAQ up more than 3%. That's 685 points. And look at the Dow up 2.6%. That's 1,231 points higher. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.27% and the 2-year yield at 3.76%. And as expected, oil is lower. Both WTI and Brent crude now near $94 a barrel. Spot gold more than 1% higher, around $47.60 per ounce, and the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is less than 1% lower. Sources say a key Saudi oil pipeline to the Red Sea suffered only limited damage from an earlier drone strike on one of its pumping stations, and that the damage from the strike was limited and contained, and the pipeline was not shut down as a result of that strike. The East-West pipeline has served as a vital lifeline for getting oil from Saudi Arabia, bypassing the largely closed Strait of Hormuz. And Delta Airlines oil refinery helped reduce the fuel price paid per gallon in the first quarter by more than 2% and will provide a $300 million benefit to second quarter expenses. Delta's first quarter earnings report beat expectations, and Delta stock jumped after the company reported those earnings and the Iran ceasefire was announced. Delta shares more than 6% higher. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's get to Balance of Power with Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Running us through a market that is adjusting in real time to a ceasefire agreement in the Middle East, though it is one that even one of the architects of it, someone who was influential in getting us to this point, the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, is describing it as fragile. And those fragilities are on display as Iran says the Strait of Hormuz is still not reopened, at least to oil tankers, because of Israel's ongoing fighting against Hezbollah in Lebanon. We still have questions, too, about the fate of Iran's nuclear program, whether or not they will agree to stop all enrichment and forfeit the remaining enriched uranium that they still have in their territory. And there are other questions, too, about the wider ramifications of where this exactly leaves the Middle East and our posture in it. And we're going to get into that in just a moment with General Fink McKenzie, who used to lead Central Command. But first, we want to check in on the politics of all of this and the positioning of President Trump, who has for weeks been suggesting that he wanted to see a deal happen.
All I can tell you is they're begging to make a deal.
If there is no deal, we are going to hit each and every one of their electric generating plants.
We have to have a deal that's acceptable to me. And part of that deal is going to be we want free traffic of oil.
But again, free traffic of oil, as of right now, is not yet our reality. So let's turn to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is joining us live from the North Lawn of the White House. So, Tyler, it's one thing to agree to a ceasefire. It's another thing to agree more widely to a longer-term deal. How much progress, realistically, are we seeing in that direction?
Well, Kailey, at this point within the last hour, we did get a post from President Trump on Truth Social seeming to indicate that he feels that talks between the U.S. and Iran are on track to happen, even as we get this reporting that the ceasefire is at this point very tenuous. Now, President Trump in this post said that only the U.S. and Iran will know what is happening behind closed doors, and outlined that he feels that there is only one set of what he is calling, quote, meaningful points that would contribute to an agreement. Earlier today, as you well know, in another post on Truth Social, the president outlined that the U.S. is looking for an agreement where Iran would no longer have a nuclear weapon and would work with the U.S. on extracting its already enriched nuclear material. He said in exchange, the U.S. is considering lifting some of those sanctions and tariffs on the country. But until we get to talk about a longer-term deal, this ceasefire needs to hold. And as you've already outlined, we're seeing some of those sticking points start to emerge, including Iranian state media reporting that traffic through the Strait of Hormuz continues to remain halted, and that Iran is now preparing for what they are calling a serious attack in response to Israel's moves in Lebanon. Now, keep in mind, Israel has opened a separate front in Lebanon to target the Iranian-backed Hezbollah militant group, and the U.S. and Israel say that that is not part of any ceasefire deal. In fact, President Trump called it a, quote, separate skirmish in an interview with PBS News earlier today. But Kailey, according to Pakistan's foreign minister who is helping to mediate these discussions, they are saying that Iran wants to see that front of the war combined in to any potential ceasefire, or else they are going to continue these strikes on Gulf state energy infrastructure.
Well, and Tyler, when we consider not just the messaging we're getting from Pakistan and the Truth Social posts we're getting from President Trump, we are expecting this hour a briefing from the White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt. It has not begun yet. But aside hearing from her, will we be hearing more directly, at least on camera, from President Trump, who's meeting with the Secretary General of NATO at the White House today, but hasn't invited press into that?
At this point, that meeting at 3:30 p.m. Eastern does remain closed, but to be a fly in the wall, perhaps it will open up because, of course, Secretary General Mark Rutte and President Trump are considered to have a relatively warm relation. But transatlantic relations have been strained by the war in Iran. As you well know, President Trump last week issued perhaps his starkest warning that the U.S. is considering leaving the alliance. But I can actually say that our own reporting from Bloomberg News indicates it's actually been recent comments from Secretary of State Marco Rubio that the U.S. should reassess its position in NATO that has caused alarm bells throughout Europe. Now, of course, and as you discussed last hour, this is perhaps more easier said than done. It would require 2/3 a majority vote in the Senate. But Kailey, we know that the president has some other things that he could do. Our reporting indicates that there is real concern that the U.S. could stay in NATO, but perhaps not adhere to Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause. President Trump could withdraw the U.S. ambassador to NATO or refuse outright to participate in joint military exercises. So no doubt there's going to be a lot to listen to when it comes to that meeting, but at this point, it remains closed to the press.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. So press not getting the invite as of yet into the White House where that meeting is taking place. But press were present at the Pentagon this morning when we heard once again in the joint briefing from the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, the general, and the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who described victory in Iran.
Operation Epic Fury was a historic and overwhelming victory on the battlefield. Iran begged for this ceasefire. Iran's Air Force has been wiped out. Iran no longer has an air defense, any sort of a comprehensive air defense system. We own their skies. Their missile program is functionally destroyed.
He says it's victory with a capital V, but I wonder if our next guest agrees with that assessment. I'm pleased to say that General Frank McKenzie is joining us, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, now executive director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. General, thank you for your time. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. If it were to end here, if this ceasefire ultimately ends in a lasting truce or cessation of hostilities, would you describe this as victory with a capital V?
I would, if we're able to get from Iran what's in our negotiating position. And I think what I've seen of public statements about the U.S. negotiating position and what we're going to demand of Iran is going to be free passage to the Strait of Hormuz, limitations on their nuclear program, limitations on their ballistic missile program, and limitations on the proxy exportation of terror across the region. If those conditions obtain, then clearly this will be a significant victory. And the hard part is ahead of us. Look, the Iranians are not great fighters. They've never been great fighters. They're brilliant negotiators, and they know how to negotiate. They grew up in a culture that is based on negotiation. They will now seek to draw negotiations out, change the terms, and create a new reality. And that's our task now will be to take the substantive operational victory which we have obtained and turn it into something lasting and strategic.
So you say, General, that the Iranians are not great fighters, and yet they had the world and global commerce and the companies that operate tankers that needed to go through the Strait of Hormuz believing that they posed a credible threat to the safety and security of those cargo and crews. And if even President Trump himself is saying that vessels need to be coordinating with Iranian armed forces if they want to pass, if Iran is openly talking about charging vessels to do so, is that not still a lever that Iran is going to be able to say it can pull at any time?
Iran has powerful geographic advantages based on where they are in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States Navy has the ability to open that strait and keep it open if required to do so. We haven't asked the Navy to do that just yet. That could still be in the future. Look, here we are less than really 24 hours into this ceasefire. It appears not to be holding completely on the Iranian side anyway. I'm going to be real interested to see what happens in the next 48, 72 hours if the Iranians are actually going to adhere to it. And that would be good if they did, because I think, as I've told you, there's a path forward here for negotiations. But part of that path is going to have to be opening the Strait of Hormuz. Should they choose not to do that, we do have the capability to open that strait.
Well, and beyond our capabilities to open the strait, the president also was suggesting that the U.S. military had the capability to wipe out, or in his words, kill, make die, a whole civilization. Obviously, we did not see him follow through on that threat with the agreement for this 2-week ceasefire, but our service members had to be ready for that, General. And I wonder if you were inside Central Command still, how you would have had to be prepared for 8 p.m. last night, and if you expect that they are still in that ready posture as we speak because of the fragility of this ceasefire.
So the job of a combatant commander is to give the president and the secretary of defense options, to give them military activities that will support the policy goals of the United States. I would argue that Central Command has done that over the last 30 days, brought us to this point in a really very effective military campaign against Iran. Now it's the task of our diplomats to take what we fashioned operationally and militarily, turn it into a lasting strategic outcome.
Well, and when we consider the strategic outcomes here, it's one thing to consider specifically what this means for the Middle East, for Iran and its future, whether it's nuclear capabilities or ballistic missile capabilities, what that therefore means for the U.S. interests in this region. But in terms of the signal sent by this conflict elsewhere, knowing, for example, that the U.S. has expended heavily munitions and that it may take some time to replenish those, especially if for whatever reason we have to go back in and strike again if the ceasefire can't hold. Does it not signal that despite military strength that may have been shown with this operation, that there could be some weakness ahead because we simply won't have those same stockpiles to fall back on?
Well, of course, stockpiles can be rebuilt. I think a lesson that a lot of people...
Doesn't that take years, though, General?
It depends on what we do with our defense industrial base, which is another question entirely. I think long before the conflict with Iran, there was a sense within this administration that the defense industrial base was too small, too inefficient to actually support the size of the force that we have in the field today against the requirements that we might have. And I believe a number of initiatives are underway to repair that right now. But go back to your original question. I think potential foes across the world are looking very thoughtfully at the success of the U.S. joint force in the campaign over the last 30 days. And yes, you're right. We have eaten into magazines, but I would note again, those magazines can be replenished, and they can be replenished quickly depending on the level of emphasis we choose to put on it.
It's interesting to consider that emphasis, as we know the Pentagon is expected at least to make a $200 billion supplemental funding request on top of the $1.5 trillion defense budget the president already requested of Congress last week. Our defense industrial base obviously is a consideration here, but we heard at the Pentagon today from both the Joint Chief Chair and Defense Secretary Hegseth about the degradation of Iran's defense industrial base in particular, noting how they were specifically targeting sites that make drones, that make missiles. So what about Iran's capability to rebuild that if it so chooses?
So I think Iran's capabilities to build missiles, to build drones, very, very degraded. I don't read the classified information, so I don't know the details. But I would say this, that fact, coupled with our ability to maintain a persistent overhead presence over Iran, will give us very good visibility into the status of what's left of their industrial base. And we'll know very quickly if they choose to rebuild it. And that could lead us to other decisions in the future to restrike. All those things are possible. All of those things the Iranians are acutely aware of.
Well, and we've already heard about the surveillance that we have on the remaining nuclear sites and material after Operation Midnight Hammer. The defense secretary was talking about that today. We've had repeatedly suggestions that they could always go in and strike again if they needed to, which is why a diplomatic agreement around that enriched uranium is going to be so critical here. I also wonder, General, as we're considering the Middle East more widely, the idea that Iran has, and still today sporadically, was hitting other Gulf nations, that this was not just about U.S. assets or Israeli assets, that we have seen this spread elsewhere. If this has fundamentally reshaped the Middle East in some way, and even potentially had the effect of drawing some of these other Gulf states closer to Israel, if they may now see their interests as being more aligned.
No, you're absolutely right. The Iranian decision to strike unprovoked its neighbors in the Gulf is the equivalent of Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor. We were mobilized to fight Japan. It would have been hard for President Roosevelt to mobilize people against Germany. Hitler took the problem out of his hands by declaring war on the United States. That's a little of what the Iranians have done by attacking their neighbors across the region. What began with icy neutrality among those countries is now moving to support for our goals. And you're right, the clear long-term future in the region in terms of defense and a variety of other things is going to feature the continued integration of Israel into those activities. That's inevitable. And the Iranians have no one to blame for that but themselves.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if indeed the president does get the expansion of the Abraham Accords that he has long said he is seeking. Just on Israel, though, it is worth pointing out, General, that, of course, Israel right now says Lebanon is not part of this ceasefire, that it is going to continue its operations against Hezbollah. Clearly, that is not sitting well with Iran, who wants to see that front halted as well if there's to be ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. How should we consider Israel's position and the threat posed by Hezbollah right now in terms of how the region moves forward and how this particular ceasefire can move forward if it can?
Well, Lebanese Hezbollah poses a mortal threat to the existence of the state of Israel. They have sworn that for many years. Their activities over the decades have been very clear, and they've also been a parasite on the state of Lebanon. I think Israel's attacks are actually well justified going into Lebanon. We'll see what Iran does. I think Iran will actually think very long and hard before attacking Israel as a result of the ongoing operations that Israel's conducting in Lebanon. I think that would be a mistake for Iran to stand too strongly behind the idea of coupling what's going on in Lebanon to what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. That would be a mistake for them.
All right, General, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg. That's the former Central Command Commander, General Fink, McKenzie, now with the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. We appreciate you joining us. And on the subject of Israel, we are hearing from the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who says Israel made, quote, huge gains in this war, but is poised to resume the war whenever necessary. Once again, this is a fragile ceasefire that we're speaking of here, and we'll have more on that next here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I would point out here in Washington, we are keeping eyes on the White House as we were just given the 2-minute warning to the beginning of the briefing from the White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt. She's set to answer questions from the press momentarily. And of course, as we are awaiting further detail and insight into this tenuous ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, we'll bring you those relevant remarks from her. But we're also getting remarks right now from the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's talked about great gains that Israel has made in this war with Iran, but is going on to say that this isn't the war's end, and specifically that he insisted that this ceasefire would not include Hezbollah, that any deal would not include Hezbollah and the ongoing fighting in Lebanon, which is a problem that Iran has made clear it has. It would like to see that stop if the Strait of Hormuz is to be fully reopened. So it begs the question as to whether or not the end of this conflict really is near. The Israeli prime minister, again, says this isn't the war's end. And if the war is not over, does that mean there is still merit in a war powers vote in the United States Congress? The Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, thinks so. He told reporters this earlier today.
I'm announcing that today the Senate will vote next week on the War Powers Resolution. Congress must reassert its authority, especially at this dangerous moment. No president, Democrat or Republican, should take this country to war alone. Not now, not ever.
So let's get into this with our political panel. Rick Davis and Laura Fink are with me. Rick is Bloomberg politics contributor, Republican strategist, and Stonecourt Capital partner. Laura, Democratic strategist and CEO and founder of Rebelle Communications. And I apologize to you both if I have to cut you off at any point to go to the briefing from the press secretary. But Rick, just beginning with this idea of a war powers vote next week, is there still a point? Was there ever, knowing that President Trump could very easily veto it if it were to pass?
Sure. I think this is, basically performative. I think that Democrats want to try to continue the debate in the U.S. that, has been going on around the world relative to the president's motivations to get in. They see the polling data. They realize it's an incredibly unpopular war. And I wouldn't be surprised that we're still having a conversation about a War Powers Act by the time of the November election. So this is just something that I think Democratic leadership has to be committed to if they want to try to politicize the war in the best possible way. And I don't think it's going to result in anything. So there is an effect, some point that they look ineffective. But it's a no-brainer for a political exercise of an attack on this administration.
Well, and of course, that exercise may be more potent if we are still seeing the war ongoing or if we're in a ceasefire. Laura, is this worth the Democrats' energy at this point, even as a political exercise, as Rick suggests?
Well, the Republicans have all two branches of Congress, and so this is something that they are able to do. But I think the conversation about war powers is something that is on Americans' mind, and it's in the conversation. How did we get here? How did we choose to strike? And you're not just seeing that among the American people in polling, as he suggested. Like they want answers, and they'd like to have some sort of understanding of how to limit the president from doing things that perhaps Congress has not approved of. This is an ongoing conversation that has happened, but because of the uniform opposition to this war, and because it's so strong, the American opposition among the populace is so strong, I think we're having a renewed conversation here. But I also think that we have to look at the fact that that Republicans are joining in. So you've got, I believe it was Senator Ron Johnson who was saying that, we really have to worry about President Trump and the decisions that he's making on a day-to-day basis with these wild threats that he continues to engage in, the changes in deadline, et cetera. You see worry on the Republican side and fear that decisions will be made in the future that impact Americans and have, a serious impact and effect.
All right, Laura Fink and Rick Davis, stay with me. We do want to go now, though, live to the White House as the press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, is speaking about this ceasefire. She calls it a victory for the U.S. Let's listen on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Including 16 entire classes of Iranian warships. Despite once being the largest undersea force in the Middle East, Iran now has 0 submarine vessels. 97% of Iran's once massive inventory of more than 5,000 naval mines has also been targeted and destroyed. Iran's air forces are functionally and operationally irrelevant at this point, after the United States maintained total air dominance over their country for weeks on end. To underscore the significance of this, before Operation Epic Fury, the Iranian Air Force would fly between 30 to 100 flights per day. Today, that number is 0. Iran's ability to fund and support its terrorist proxies has been greatly reduced. At this point, Iran can no longer distribute weapons to its proxies in the region. And most importantly, Iran will not be able to acquire nuclear weapons. Prior to the start of this successful operation, Iran was aggressively expanding its short-range ballistic missile arsenal. Through these weapons and its navy, Iran was attempting to build a military buildup around their country that would pose an imminent and existential threat to the United States military assets in the Middle East, our allies in the region, and ultimately the free world. Iran was pursuing this dangerous and aggressive strategy for one reason: to hold the entire world hostage to its terrorist ambitions. The Iranians aim to use their expanded military capabilities as a shield around their country to continue achieving their ultimate goal internally, building nuclear bombs. But their murderous and evil plans have been blown up, quite literally and figuratively, along with their military, their nuclear program, and most of their senior leadership, including the former Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Their command and control structures were also massively disrupted after being struck more than 2,000 times. Many of their remaining leaders are paralyzed in fear and no longer enjoy the freedom to move around their country freely and meet openly. Thanks to the unmatched excellence of our warriors at the direction of the Commander-in-Chief, the world has just witnessed a historically swift and successful military triumph. President Trump started Operation Epic Fury with strategic military objectives, and the United States has clearly achieved them. As we mark this progress, we also remember and honor the 13 American heroes who laid down their lives in this noble effort. I know President Trump and our grateful nation honors their ultimate sacrifice, and we will never forget them. May God bless their families. The valiant efforts of all of our incredible service members created maximum leverage for the President of the United States, allowing he and his leadership team to engage in tough negotiations over the past couple of weeks that have now created an opening for a diplomatic solution and long-term peace in the Middle East. The President's maximum pressure and the leverage created by the success of Operation Epic Fury led to the Iranian regime asking for and ultimately agreeing to a ceasefire proposal with the United States. Iran could no longer tolerate being bombed or taking the gamble of what was to come following President Trump's 8 p.m. deadline last night. Iran has agreed to open the Strait of Hormuz, and as the President said, we have received a proposal from the Iranians that has been determined to be a workable basis on which to negotiate. I've seen a lot of inaccurate coverage today from the media about these negotiations and these plans already. So let me be clear and correct the record. The Iranians originally put forward a 10-point plan that was fundamentally unserious, unacceptable, and completely discarded. It was literally thrown in the garbage by President Trump and his negotiating team. Many outlets in this room have falsely reported on that plan as being acceptable to the United States, and that is false. With the President's deadline fast approaching and the United States military completely decimating Iran with each passing hour, the regime acknowledged reality to the negotiating team. They put forward a more reasonable and entirely different and condensed plan to the President and his team. President Trump and the team determined the new modified plan was a workable basis on which to negotiate and to align it with our own 15-point proposal. The President's red lines, namely the end of Iranian enrichment in Iran, have not changed. And the idea that President Trump would ever accept an Iranian wish list as a deal is completely absurd. The President will only make a deal that serves in the best interests of the United States of America, and he as a negotiating team will focus on this effort over the next 2 weeks, so long as the Strait of Hormuz remains open with no limitations or delays. These extraordinarily sensitive and complex negotiations will take place behind closed doors over the course of the next 2 weeks. I would strongly advise the media against running with narratives that have no basis in fact. What Iran says publicly or feeds to all of you in the press is much different than what they communicate to the United States, the President, and his team privately. Never underestimate President Trump's ability to successfully advance America's interests and broker peace. President Trump has a proven track record of achieving good deals on behalf of the United States and the American people, and he will only accept one that puts America first. With that, I will take your questions today. I'm sure you have a lot of them. In our new media seat, we have Shane Harris with the AMAC Newsline. Shane, thank you for being here. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Karoline. Two questions for you. First, following the president's announcement of the ceasefire, if this is indeed the end of hostilities in Iran, what is the president's message to the American people about what was achieved for our country through Operation Epic Fury?
Sure. I think I just laid out a significant portion of that in my opening remarks. 6 weeks ago, the president looked the American people in the eye directly, and he told them that he launched this operation to take out the imminent threat that was posed by Iran. And that threat has now been greatly destroyed. Their Navy, their missiles, their defense industrial base, and their desire and their plan to build a nuclear bomb inside their country is no longer going to be allowed, can no longer happen, thanks to the remarkable success of Operation Epic Fury over the course of the last 38 days. That has been absolutely achieved, and now we're moving into the next phase of this, which is a negotiating period to put some fine points on this and to hopefully broker an agreement that can achieve long-term peace in the Middle East.
Yeah, and then second, what is the president's message to American seniors who have a much higher voter participation rate and they're likely to be a key swing vote in the midterm elections?
Well, the president loves our seniors across the country. And as you know, the president signed the One Big Beautiful Bill, the Working Families Tax Cut last year, which greatly reduced taxes on Social Security for our seniors. In fact, thanks to the Working Families Tax Cut, nearly 90% of seniors will no longer pay tax on their Social Security. That's a huge win for our seniors and also for our middle class and working families across the country with the no tax on tips provision and the no tax on overtime. Next week is tax week. You'll hear a lot from the president about how his policies have benefited the American people, and I'm proud to report that the president will be traveling next week to the great states of Nevada and Arizona to tout this historic accomplishment over the course of the next week. Thank you for being here, Shane. Gabe.
Thank you, Karoline. Iranian state media is saying that Iran has now closed off the Strait of Hormuz today in response to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. What's the White House response to that? And you just listed many military successes. I understand that. But strategically, how is the administration arguing that Iran does not have more economic leverage than it did before the start of the war?
Sure. Well, with respect to the first reporting out of Iranian state media, the president was made aware of those reports before I came to the podium. That is completely unacceptable. And again, this is a case of what they're saying publicly is different privately. We have seen an uptick of traffic in the Strait today, and I will reiterate the president's expectation and demand that the Strait of Hormuz is reopened immediately, quickly and safely. That is his expectation. It has been relayed to him privately that is what's taking place, and these reports publicly are false.
Karoline, the president yesterday threatened that a whole civilization would die if a ceasefire deal wasn't reached, understanding that Iranian leaders have previously said death to America. But why is it appropriate for the president of the United States to use that kind of language when talking about civilian targets? And was the president mocking Islam by signing off his Truth Social post over the weekend, praise be to Allah? Wouldn't that antagonize Muslim allies across the world?
Well, I understand the questions about the president's rhetoric, but what the president cares most about is results. And in fact, his very tough rhetoric and his tough negotiating style is what has led to the result that you are all witnessing today. Iran publicly acknowledging last night that they have agreed or that they wanted this ceasefire with the United States because they no longer could tolerate being bombed by our very powerful and lethal military, and that they have committed to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, which the president will hold them accountable for, and it's something the administration is closely monitoring in real time.
So,
Danny.
Should the world not take his word seriously?
The world should take his word very seriously in understanding that the president is always most interested in results. And it was the Iranians who backed down, not President Trump. He said that they would face very grave consequences, as you just laid out, by the 8 p.m. deadline if they did not agree to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And what did they do last night? They agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Danny.
Thanks, Caroline. Would President Trump like to see Lebanon included in this peace deal? As you know, there have been increased Israeli strikes on Lebanon today with dozens of casualties there.
Sure. Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire. That has been relayed to all parties involved in the ceasefire. As you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu put out a statement last night in support of the ceasefire, in support of the United States' efforts, and he's also assured the president they'll continue to be a helpful partner throughout the course of the next 2 weeks.
Is there any thought, though, that the president might like to see Lebanon included at a future date, given that it seems to be causing or potentially undermining the Iran ceasefire?
Again, this will continue to be discussed, I am sure, between the president and Prime Minister Netanyahu, the United States and Israel, and all of the parties involved. But at this point in time, they're not included in the ceasefire deal. Jeff.
Thank you. Karoline, will the U.S. take part in talks with Iran in Islamabad on Friday?
I can announce that the president is dispatching his negotiating team, led by the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Witkoff, and Mr. Kushner to Islamabad for talks this weekend. The first round of those talks will take place on Saturday morning local time, and we know we look forward to those in-person meetings.
Now, what role does the president see for the U.S. in monitoring or helping with the Strait of Hormuz going forward?
I think the president commented on that this morning. We're going to continue to monitor it very, very closely. We will be helpful in any way that we can, but we fully expect Iran to do this, and the president has made that quite clear as well. It's, again, as his statement said last night, this ceasefire is subject to the safe reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Again, this was just determined last night. We understand things take time, but that's the president's expectation, and he will hold everyone to it. Sure, in the green blazer.
Thank you, Kailey.
Sure, and then in front of you. But Andrew, you can go ahead.
All right.
You're not wearing a green blazer.
I am actually wearing a green blazer.
It's a little brown to me, but go ahead.
Fair enough. Regarding the president's rhetoric, when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, George W. Bush said in a message to the Iraqi people that the military campaign was directed, quote, against the lawless men who rule your country and not against you. Yesterday, the president threatened to destroy Iran's civilization, the entire civilization. Not the Iranian government, but the Iranian civilization, the Iranian people. The U.S. has been a moral leader for most of its history by fighting wars against other governments, not against civilizations. How can the president claim that America can ever have the moral high ground if he's threatening to destroy civilizations and not casting wars as fights against other governments?
Andrew, I think you should take a look at the actions of this president over the course of the past 6 weeks and the actions of our brave men and women in our United States military who have taken out essentially taken out the military of a rogue Islamic regime that has chanted death to America for 47 years, that has killed and maimed thousands of American soldiers over the course of the last 5 decades. The president absolutely has the moral high ground over the Iranian terrorist regime, and for you to even suggest otherwise is frankly insulting.
With all due respect, Karoline,
Go ahead.
with all due respect,
go ahead.
There is
just given what we've seen in Lebanon today and the increased attacks from Israel, I mean, is there any concern that Netanyahu is trying to kill the ceasefire?
The president spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu last night. And in that private conversation, Prime Minister Netanyahu relayed exactly what he said to the world publicly, that he supports the president and Israel remains a key ally and partner to the United States. They've been a tremendous partner over the course of the past 6 weeks, and we thank them for their heroic efforts as well. And the president had that conversation last night, and that was relayed to the world publicly as well. Reagan, go ahead.
Thank you, Caroline. I have a question for you on Iran, and then I have a question on the Dignity Act as well. On Iran, it's been reported that the ceasefire was struck after the involvement of 2 unlikely factors, J.D. Vance and China. What role did those parties play in striking a deal?
Well, Vice President Vance has played a very significant and a key role in this since the very beginning. Of course, he's the president's right-hand man. He is the vice president of the United States. He's been involved in all of these discussions, and as I just announced, he'll be leading this new phase of negotiations in Islamabad later this week. With respect to China, there were conversations that took place between top levels of our government and China's government. The president has great respect for President Xi and a great working relationship with him and with that country, and he looks forward to visiting China in just a few weeks.
And on the Dignity Act, it's getting a fresh push through Congress. It would give some illegal immigrants in the country a path to citizenship. What's the White House's position on this legislation, and would the president sign it if it made it to his desk?
Honestly, Reagan, I haven't spoken to the president about the legislation, but I will have that conversation, and we'll get you our formal position on it as soon as we can. You're welcome. Go ahead.
The president suggested in an interview this morning that he would support a joint U.S.-Iran venture to charge tolls for ships going through the strait. Does the president believe that the U.S. should earn revenue from the Strait of Hormuz going forward?
It's an idea the president has floated, as you know, and it's something that will continue to be discussed over the course of the next 2 weeks. But the immediate priority of the president is the reopening of the strait without any limitations, whether in the form of tolls or otherwise.
And on the highly enriched uranium, has Iran given the administration any indication that it would simply turn over the enriched uranium, or is this an expectation that the president has that he would have to send in ground troops in order to do that?
This is on the top of the priority list for the president and his negotiating team as they head into this next round of discussions. And as I said in my opener, that is a red line that the president is not going to back away from, and he's committed to ensuring that takes place. We hope it will be through diplomacy.
But have they given any indication that they would turn it over?
They have.
They have.
Yes. Trevor.
The latest news out of Iran is that the air defenses have been activated in several cities, including Isfahan, and that explosions have been heard in Isfahan. Who is bombing Iran right now?
Were those reports just as of a few minutes ago?
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously I'll have to go back and check with the national security team. I'm standing out here with all of you, but I will do that, and we will get you an answer, okay?
And then just on the civilization question that we've been talking about.
And I would just add to that point, again, I haven't seen these reports. I'm not verifying them. Not that I don't trust you, Trevor, but I want to go back and check with the experts here at the White House. I would just say, and I would echo what the vice president said this morning, this is a fragile truce. Ceasefires are fragile by nature. We've seen this with respect to the 12-day war with Iran and Israel last year. It takes time sometimes for these ceasefires to be fully effectuated. And one of the results of Operation Epic Fury was we completely dismantled Iran's command and control center, which makes it difficult for them to pass messages up and down the chain. And so we understand that. I would caution a little bit of patience, but of course we want to see the ceasefire effectuated and abided by all parties as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And the American presidential administrations, going back to Ronald Reagan, have said this formulation about nuclear war, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Is that still the view of this administration, given the president's comments about civilization?
I have no change in our view on that policy. Katie.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm just, given the gravity of what he said yesterday, what was your understanding of what he meant when he said, this civilization is going to be eliminated?
I think it was a very, very strong threat from the President of the United States that led the Iranian regime to cave to their knees and ask for a ceasefire and agree to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. So it was a very strong threat that led to results. And as the Secretary of War stated at the Pentagon this morning, it was not an empty threat by any means. The Pentagon had a target list that they were ready to hit go on at 8 p.m. last night if the Iranian regime had not agreed to open the strait, which they did, and I think that's something we should all be grateful for.
The United States is a moral leader in the world, given that
I was asked this exact same question by your colleague Andrew in the back, and I think, again, the insinuation by anyone in this room that Iran somehow has the moral high ground over the United States of America is insulting, considering the atrocities that they have committed against our people and our military over the past 5 decades. John, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. 2 questions for you. One has to do with a joint statement put out this morning by some of America's European allies, our NATO allies. And in that joint statement, they said regarding the Strait of Hormuz, our governments will contribute to ensuring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. What's the administration's reaction to that joint statement? Does that smooth things over when the president meets with NATO Secretary General a little bit later this afternoon?
I have a direct quote from the President of the United States on NATO, and I will share it with all of you. They were tested and they failed. And I would add, it's quite sad that NATO turned their backs on the American people over the course of the last 6 weeks when it's the American people who have been funding their defense. As you know, President Trump will be meeting with Secretary Ruta in a couple of hours here at the White House, and I know he looks forward to having a very frank and candid conversation with him.
And then secondly, in regards to this conflict, 38 days, as you pointed out, President Trump has said that there's been regime change. Has that regime change led to more freedoms for the Iranian people?
I think that's a question that's being asked a little bit too early, John, and we hope that is the case, but it's something that has yet to be seen.
Caroline, come on.
Eamon.
Caroline, on this question of tolling by the Iranians in the Strait of Hormuz, I've heard you talk about a number of red lines that the president has in this negotiation, but I haven't heard you say that Iranian tolling in the Strait of Hormuz is a red line. Would it be acceptable to the United States at the end of all this if the Iranians are able to charge tolls in the Strait of Hormuz?
I think the president was very clear and simplistic in his language last night in his Truth Social post, where he said that this ceasefire is subject to the free, safe, and immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. That's very plain language, and it should be taken at face value.
You mean free of charge?
Carrie, go ahead. Without limitation, including tolls, yes. Carrie.
Quick follow-up on the tolling. Why would the U.S. allow Iran to collect tolls in the Strait of Hormuz? That's not something that we've opposed for a number of years now.
Again, that's not something we've said that we've definitively accepted. The joint venture is something that was proposed by the president, but he was very clear in his statement last night. He wants to see the strait reopened immediately without limitation, and that's something we're going to hold them to.
A second question on
family and friends in Iran. I myself am Iranian, and I've been talking to them through the blackout. One of my family members yesterday said goodbye to me. So what message should we be sending Iranians when they message me saying what should they be doing right now? How should they stay safe? Because they really don't know what to do.
I think the president's main priority, and my main priority as his spokeswoman, is to make sure that clear messages are sent to the American people, of course, which is my job today. With respect to the Iranian people, the president, has taken out the imminent threat that was posed by their military to the United States, to our allies in the region, to our forces in the region. And of course, as the president has long said, he hopes that Iran will be a country of peace, of prosperity, and we're moving into this next round of negotiations to hopefully come to an agreement with this new regime that will create long-term stability in the Middle East.
He has said that they should stay inside of their homes and also take back their country. So there's a contradiction there. So how do you address that?
Again, we're moving into this next round of negotiations with the remnants of the regime and those that we are speaking with now to hopefully reach a place of peace long-term for the region, and that includes the Iranian people as well. In the blue, go ahead.
Thank you, Caroline. The White House posted the statement from the Iranian government that passage in the strait will be coordinated with Iran's armed forces. As of today, who controls the Strait of Hormuz?
Again, these statements were put out 12 hours ago. We expect that the strait will be opened immediately. As I've said earlier, we have seen an uptick in traffic in the strait, and it's something that we are monitoring minute by minute, hour by hour as the days go on.
Who controls the strait right now?
Two questions. One on the deportations of Iranian officials, and then on the negotiations. Are there still security concerns about Vice President Vance being part of these peace talks, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner? And then two, given the ongoing deportation of General Soleimani's niece, does the Trump administration plan to deport more relatives or people in the families of Iranian officials that are in the U.S.?
Certainly, anyone who is here fraudulently. I understand one of the individuals who their visa was revoked by Secretary Rubio and they were deported by ICE. They had a fraudulent asylum claim. That's against the laws of the United States. So anyone who is here illegally or fraudulently is subject to our nation's immigration laws and will be removed from our country. And I know this continues to be a top priority for the State Department, working in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security. With respect to the safety of the Vice President, we fully trust the United States Secret Service to do their job, to keep the Vice President and the President's negotiating team safe. They do a tremendous job, and we fully trust them to do that.
Caroline.
In the back, go ahead.
Thank you, Caroline. The President has said Cuba is next. What's the message to the American people regarding Cuba, and what can Cubans expect in relation to this statement?
Well, look, I think when President Trump said that, and he later clarified after making that statement, that he meant the Cuban regime is bound to fall. The country is very weak. They're in a very weak position economically, obviously, financially. The Cuban people are fed up with their government, as they should be. And these talks and discussions continue to happen at the highest level of our government. I don't have any updates or announcements for you with respect to Cuba policy today. Good to see you.
Thank you, Karoline. Secretary Hegseth said this morning that U.S. troops would be sticking around. Can you expound upon that, what we should expect from U.S. troops in theater for the next 2 weeks and beyond?
I would defer you to the Pentagon for any specifics on assets that have been in place in the Middle East, but take the Secretary at his word, and also the President has reiterated this as well in his own words, that we're not going to move anything immediately. Again, this is a 2-week ceasefire where we hope at the end, and we expect at the end, we'll have a good agreement between the United States and Iran, but in the meantime, we're going to ensure that our military is always at the ready of the Commander-in-Chief. I'll take a couple more in the back. Sure.
Thank you.
On NATO, I'll take your question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Karoline. On NATO, can you tell me, is the United States still considering withdrawing from NATO? Is that still a possibility?
It's something the President has discussed, and I think it's something the President will be discussing in a couple of hours with Secretary General Ruta, and perhaps you'll hear directly from the President following that meeting later this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
All right, that was the White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, heard live on Bloomberg TV and radio, looking ahead to the meeting that President Trump is scheduled to have with the Secretary General Mark Rutte at the White House. 3:30 p.m. Eastern time is when that is expected. And the press secretary did suggest we may hear from President Trump after that, as she did not push back on the notion that the president may be considering withdrawing from the NATO alliance, given his disappointment with it and lack of participation in this conflict in the Middle East. Of course, it would take an act of Congress to do so. But the press secretary went well beyond that when talking about the ceasefire, at least for this 2-week period that has been agreed to by the U.S. and Iran. She described that as a victory for the United States. And she said it was Iran that backed down, not the U.S. She also reiterated that it is President Trump's expectation that the Strait of Hormuz will be opened immediately, suggesting that even though Iran publicly is saying that it is not for oil tankers due to Israel's ongoing strikes in Lebanon, that the suggestions in private, she said, are very different. And on Lebanon, after we heard from the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, that he made sure Lebanon would not be included in the ceasefire agreement, the press secretary did state that plainly. She said that Lebanon is not included. Obviously, that is something that Iran would like to see change, which underscores the fragility of this truce, which was emphasized as well by Karoline Leavitt. All of that said, of course, she did say that this ceasefire has been in place for now. Obviously, there's a lot of questions as we're still seeing strikes. She chalked that up to the fact that the U.S. has destroying a lot of Iran's military communications capability. But it's a lot of questions that we still have to be answered. And I'll be back for more on the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, Fed Minutes are just ahead on Bloomberg Business Week Daily right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.